It is no secret that we humans have always been fascinated by the grim, the macabre, and the sinister. But why is it that we are so preoccupied with all things death? Is it because we fear our inevitable mortality?
I'm really afraid to die.
You are going to die!
Is it because we dread what comes after?
Daddy, where do we go when we die?
Hell!
Or is it because our basest primal instincts derive a perverse pleasure from the pain and suffering of others? Whatever the case, there's no better place to explore such a profound and introspective query of the soul than Hollywood, the entertainment capital of the world, which, no earlier than a couple of hundred years ago, gave us the deepest insight into the darkest recesses of humanity. The horror movie. A vast and diverse cinematic genre where we can see humans like us being spooked, haunted, startled, maddened, maimed, tortured, murdered, resurrected, cursed, shunned, isolated, and humiliated without ever having to take moral culpability upon ourselves. I'm Sean Adams, and alongside my good friend and co-producer Colin Moore, we'll be taking on an epic voyage through time and space to discover a brief history of horror. For the longest time, the scariest genre of cinematic film has been the horror movie. This can even be dated back to 1895, when a short film entitled L'arrivée d'un train gare de la Ciotat became the first ever horror movie by causing the primitive audience to literally flee the theatre in terror, mistakenly believing that they were going to be crushed by a train. And thus, horror was born. Ever since that fateful day, the genre has continued to flourish, from the creepy what's-going-ons of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, to the misshapen lurchings of the Frankenstein, to the blood-sucking shambles of Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's hard not to recognize the magic of this, the classic age of horror. Following those years came the swinging 60s, and thus another classic era of horror was born. With auteurs like Alfred Hitchcock, Roger Corman, and William Castle at the helm, the films took an altogether darker turn. If you told somebody today that you'd found this scene scary, you'd likely be called a pussy. But for audiences in those days, it was about the equivalent of seeing something like this. But back then, they had to make do with what little they had. After the 60s came the 70s, and then the 80s. And while mainstream horror movies tended to get a little bit boring in those years, there were still the occasional diamonds to be found. But as time goes on and special effects have continued to evolve, it's hard not to look back at some of these so-called gems without thinking they've become a bit old and stupid, and look positively daft compared to the totally not stupid modern offerings. So I'm afraid it's time to say move over Monroe, farewell Friedkin, and hit the road Hitchcock, for it is time to usher in the new masters of horror, and I for one welcome them. And that pretty much concludes our brief history of horror. But now that we've talked about what horror is, perhaps it's about time we talked about what horror means to us. So I pass you over to my good friend and co-producer Colin Moore for his thoughts. Well, I think that says a lot about the profound impact horror has had on our lives, but now we want to hear from you, the viewer. Please comment and tell us what you found the most scary in movies or in life, or if you've had any experience with a ghost. Please let us know. As for what scared me the most, well, I'd rather not say. So, with that, until next time, and, of course, sweet dreams. And also, we're doing this ghost hunting thing, so if you could also just go...